Complex world of geopolitics, certain voices emerge that challenge our most fundamental assumptions. Professor Jiang, a distinguished scholar from the field of predictive history, is one such voice. His work focuses on analyzing long-term historical patterns to forecast future conflicts and power shifts. He is not a sensationalist but a meticulous researcher, known for his data-driven and often uncomfortable conclusions. In 2024, long before the first missiles of Operation Epic Fury were launched, Professor Jiang made a bold and startling prediction. He argued that if the United States were to engage in a direct military conflict with Iran, it would ultimately lose. This was a statement that ran contrary to the prevailing wisdom in Washington and other Western capitals. The central question his analysis raises is profound and deeply unsettling for many. How could the world's foremost military superpower, with its unparalleled technological advantages and defense budget, possibly be defeated by a regional power like Iran? The answer, according to Professor Jiang, does not lie in a conventional battlefield scenario of tanks versus tanks or jets versus jets. Instead, it is found in a deeper understanding of Iran's unique strategic doctrine, its economic leverage, and the fundamental asymmetries that define modern warfare. His prediction is not about a single battle, but about a prolonged, unwinnable conflict that would drain American resources, prestige, and political will. Professor Jiang's expertise is not in military hardware, but in the grand strategy that nations employ over decades. He views the current conflict not as a recent development but as the culmination of more than 20 years of careful preparation by Tehran. While the United States was engaged in wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, Jiang posits that Iran was observing, learning, and adapting. It studied American vulnerabilities, not on the battlefield, but in the economic, political, and psychological spheres. This long-term strategic patience, he argues, has given Iran a significant and widely underestimated advantage as the conflict escalates in this spring of 2026. His prediction is now being tested in real time. The death of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, in a US-Israeli strike might seem like a decisive victory to some. However, in Professor Jiang's framework, this event is merely an opening move in a much larger and more dangerous game. He suggests that such an act, rather than decapitating the regime, would instead trigger a pre-planned and multifaceted response designed to inflict maximum pain on the United States and its allies. Understanding Jiang's reasoning is therefore crucial for anyone seeking to look beyond the headlines and grasp the perilous path that lies ahead for America and the world. Professor Jiang's analysis begins with a simple but powerful premise. Iran has been preparing for this specific war for over 2 decades. This was not a passive or defensive posture, it was an active and strategic effort to understand and counter American power. While Washington's attention was consumed by the war on terror and nation-building projects in other parts of the Middle East, Iran was diligently studying its primary adversary. It watched how the United States military operated, how its political system responded to pressure, and, most importantly, where its greatest weaknesses were located. This period of intense observation formed the bedrock of its current military and political strategy. The Iranian leadership concluded early on that it could never hope to match the United States in a conventional military confrontation. Attempting to build a comparable air force or navy would be both economically ruinous and strategically foolish. Therefore, Iran pivoted its resources and intellectual energy toward asymmetric warfare. This strategy focuses on exploiting an opponent's weaknesses rather than confronting their strengths. It involves using unconventional tactics, low-cost technologies, and a deep network of regional allies to create a multi-front conflict that a traditional military force is ill-equipped to handle. It is honestly a strategy of 1,000 cuts, designed to bleed a giant slowly. A key part of this preparation involved embedding its strategic thinking deep within the state's security apparatus. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, became the primary engine for developing and executing this asymmetric doctrine. They cultivated expertise not just in missile technology and drone manufacturing, but also in cyber warfare, economic disruption, and information campaigns. They prepared for a conflict that would be fought not only in the skies over the Persian Gulf, but also on the world's stock markets, in its shipping lanes, and across the internet. This holistic approach to warfare is something Professor Jiang believes the West has consistently failed to appreciate fully. This long-term planning has given Iran a level of strategic depth that is now becoming apparent. The recent attacks are not haphazard acts of revenge. They are the execution of a well-rehearsed plan. Iran anticipated that its nuclear facilities would be targeted and had a response ready. It knew which economic nodes were most critical to America's regional allies and had them in its sights. This strategic foresight means that Iran is not simply reacting to events as they unfold. In many ways, it is fighting the war it has long prepared for, on terms that it has largely dictated, a chilling affirmation of Professor Jiang's 2024 prediction. A cornerstone of Iran's asymmetric strategy, as detailed by Professor Jiang, is its masterful use of proxy groups across the Middle East. These are not simply mercenaries or loosely affiliated militias, they are integral components of Iran's national security doctrine. Groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, Hamas in Palestine, and various Shia militias in Iraq and Syria function as extensions of Iranian power. For years, Iran has armed, trained, and funded these organizations, transforming them into formidable forces that can project power and create chaos far from Iran's own borders. This allows Iran to challenge its adversaries without engaging in direct state-on-state confrontation. This network of proxies provides Iran with immense strategic advantages. First, it creates plausible deniability. When a Houthi missile strikes a target in Saudi Arabia or Hezbollah threatens Israel's northern border, Iran can distance itself from the action, complicating any direct military response from the United States or its allies. This forces its opponents into a difficult position. Either they attack Iran directly and risk a major regional war, or they limit their response to the proxies, leaving the ultimate source of the instability untouched. This strategic ambiguity is a powerful tool that keeps Iran's enemies off balance and perpetually reactive to threats across multiple fronts. Furthermore, these proxy groups act as laboratories for Iranian military innovation and intelligence gathering. For 2 decades they have been on the front lines, engaging with American and Israeli military technology. They have learned how to counter advanced surveillance systems, how to jam sophisticated electronics, and how to use low-cost drones and missiles to achieve strategic effects. This battlefield experience is invaluable. The data and tactics gleaned from skirmishes in Yemen or Syria are fed back to Tehran, refined, and then redistributed throughout the network. In essence, these proxies have allowed Iran to study and weaken the United States military by proxy. The current conflict demonstrates the devastating effectiveness of this strategy. In the wake of the strikes on Iran, retaliation has not just come from within Iran itself. The Houthis have intensified their attacks on shipping, Shia militias in Iraq have targeted United States bases, and the entire region is on high alert for action from Hezbollah. This coordinated multi-front response is exactly what Professor Jiang predicted. It turns a bilateral conflict between the United States and Iran into a sprawling, regional conflagration that is incredibly difficult to contain. It forces the United States to spread its resources thin, defending allies and assets across a vast geographical area against a swarm of diverse threats. Professor Jiang argues that Iran's most potent weapon is not a missile, but its ability to inflict catastrophic damage on the global economy. The leadership in Tehran understands that America's power is deeply intertwined with the stability of the international financial system and the free flow of commerce. Therefore, a core tenet of their war strategy is to attack this system at its most vulnerable points. The primary target is not the United States Navy's Fifth Fleet, but the oil tankers, container ships, and critical infrastructure that form the backbone of global trade. This approach turns every consumer, corporation, and government into a stakeholder in the conflict. The most obvious and critical choke point is the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway is the jugular vein of the global energy market. Approximately 20% of the world's total oil consumption passes through it every day. By threatening to mine, blockade, or otherwise disrupt passage through the strait, Iran holds a figurative gun to the head of the world economy. Even the threat of such an action can send oil prices soaring, trigger stock market panics, and plunge economies into recession. As the conflict has escalated, we have already seen this effect, with oil prices becoming highly volatile and shipping insurance premiums skyrocketing, confirming another key element of Jiang's analysis. This economic warfare is not limited to the oil trade. Iran's strategy involves targeting the critical economic infrastructure of America's allies in the Gulf Cooperation Council, or GCC. Nations like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Bahrain are not just hosting United States military bases, they are also global hubs for finance, logistics, and commerce. Recent drone strikes that damaged Amazon facilities in the UAE and Bahrain were not random acts of terror. They were calculated messages, demonstrating Iran's capability to reach deep into these countries and disrupt their modern, globalized economies. This creates immense pressure on these allied governments, who must weigh their allegiance to the United States against the devastating economic consequences of the war. By making the war economically unbearable, Iran aims to erode the political will of the United States and its partners. Professor Jiang contends that while the American public may tolerate a distant military campaign, they will not tolerate a war that leads to a spike in gasoline prices, a stock market crash, and widespread supply chain disruptions. This strategy shifts the battlefield from a remote desert to the daily lives of American citizens. It is a modern form of siege warfare, where the goal is to exhaust the enemy's economic and social resilience long before its military is defeated, making it an incredibly difficult and costly war for the United States to sustain. Beyond the global oil market, Professor Jiang highlights an even more existential threat that forms a crucial part of Iran's strategy: the deliberate targeting of water and food security in the Gulf. The wealthy modern nations of the GCC have built their gleaming cities in one of the world's most arid regions. This modern miracle is, well, almost entirely dependent on a single technology: water desalination. Massive plants along the coast convert seawater into the fresh water needed for drinking, sanitation, and agriculture. This reliance creates a profound and often overlooked vulnerability that Iran is poised to exploit with devastating effect. An astonishing 60% of the water consumed in GCC countries comes from these desalination plants. They are large, stationary, and highly complex facilities, making them soft targets for missile or drone attacks. A successful strike on just a few key plants in Saudi Arabia or the UAE could cripple their water supply within days. The societal impact would be immediate and catastrophic, leading to severe water rationing, public health crises, and mass panic. Professor Jiang argues that this is a primary objective for Iran, as it would cause a level of internal chaos and pressure on the ruling governments that military strikes alone could never achieve. Similarly, the food supply of the Gulf states is incredibly fragile. These desert nations import up to 90% of their food, with the vast majority arriving by sea through the very shipping lanes that Iran now threatens. By disrupting maritime traffic in the Strait of Hormuz and the wider Persian Gulf, Iran can effectively lay siege to its regional rivals. Empty supermarket shelves and soaring food prices would quickly follow any sustained disruption. This would not only create immense hardship for the population, but also generate intense domestic pressure on the GCC leadership to de-escalate the conflict and distance themselves from the United States. This two-pronged attack on water and food creates an unbearable dilemma for America's Gulf allies. They are caught between their security commitments to Washington and the existential needs of their own populations. Professor Jiang's prediction suggests that as Iran tightens this noose, the political unity of the anti-Iran coalition will begin to fracture. These nations will be forced to make a choice between supporting a prolonged American war effort and ensuring the basic survival of their own societies. This internal pressure, Jiang believes, is a key mechanism through which Iran will ultimately fracture the US-led alliance and achieve its strategic objectives. One of the most compelling arguments in Professor Jiang's analysis is what he calls the fatal cost asymmetry of the conflict. This refers to the massive and honestly unsustainable financial imbalance between America's defensive measures and Iran's offensive tactics. The United States military relies on some of the most technologically advanced and expensive weapon systems ever created. Its air defense networks, like the Patriot and THAAD systems, are designed to intercept sophisticated ballistic missiles. Each interceptor missile fired can cost anywhere from $1 to several million, which is, frankly, a staggering price tag for a single defensive shot. In stark contrast, Iran's primary offensive weapons are relatively simple, and most importantly, cheap. The drones that have become a signature of its asymmetric strategy can cost as little as $50,000 or even less to produce. This creates a financially ruinous dynamic for the United States and its allies. Iran can launch swarms of these low-cost drones, forcing the US and its partners to expend multi-million-dollar missiles to shoot them down. It becomes a simple but brutal math problem. Iran can afford to keep launching attackers far longer than the US can afford to keep launching defenders. This economic attrition is a central pillar of Iran's warfighting doctrine. This imbalance does more than just drain the US treasury. Professor Jiang argues that it punctures the aura of invincibility that has long sustained American hegemony. The sight of cheap drones successfully penetrating sophisticated air defenses, even if many are shot down, sends a powerful message. It demonstrates that American technological superiority is not an absolute guarantee of security. For a global power whose influence rests heavily on the perception of its military might, this is a significant psychological blow. It encourages other potential adversaries and signals to allies that reliance on American protection may no longer be a certainty. Ultimately, this cost asymmetry makes a prolonged conflict with Iran an unwinnable proposition for the United States on a purely economic basis. The US would be forced to spend billions, if not trillions, to sustain a defensive campaign against an enemy that can inflict damage for a fraction of the cost. This is not a war that can be won through a bigger defense budget. Instead, it is a trap designed to bleed the American economy, exhaust its advanced munitions stockpiles, and erode its political will to continue the fight. This, Professor Jiang asserts, is a war that America is financially ill-equipped to win. Professor Jiang is deeply skeptical of the notion that the US can achieve its stated war aim, regime change in Tehran, through air and missile strikes alone. History is replete with examples where bombing campaigns failed to break the will of a determined populace or topple an entrenched government. From the bombing of Germany and Japan in World War II to campaigns in Vietnam and Serbia, air power has proven to be a limited tool for achieving fundamental political change. It can degrade military capability and destroy infrastructure, but it often fails to sever the bond between a regime and its core supporters, sometimes even strengthening it through a rally around the flag effect. The current US and Israeli strategy, Operation Epic Fury, appears to be based on this flawed premise. The belief is that by eliminating key leaders like Ayatollah Khamenei and crippling the IRGC, the Iranian people will rise up and overthrow the government. Professor Jiang views this as a profound misreading of Iranian society and politics. While there is significant internal dissent within Iran, an external attack by the Great Satan, the US, and the Zionist entity, Israel, is the one thing most likely to unify disparate factions behind the state. Nationalism is a powerful force, and many Iranians who oppose the regime will oppose a foreign-imposed change even more vehemently. This leads to what Jiang sees as an inevitable and disastrous next step. When the air campaign fails to produce the desired regime change, the pressure on the US president will become immense. America's regional allies, particularly Israel and the GCC states who are bearing the brunt of Iran's retaliatory strikes, will demand a more decisive course of action. They will argue that the job is only half finished, and that to leave the wounded but surviving regime in place would be a strategic catastrophe. They will push for the one thing that can, in theory, guarantee regime change, a ground invasion and occupation. This is the quagmire that Professor Jiang predicts. The US will be drawn into sending ground troops into Iran, a country of nearly 90 million people with a rugged mountainous terrain and a fierce sense of national identity. It would be a conflict that would make the occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan look like minor police actions by comparison. It would involve bloody urban warfare, a protracted insurgency, and staggering human and financial costs. This, Jiang concludes, is the ultimate trap that Iran's strategy has laid. The initial air campaign is merely the bait, designed to lure the United States into an unwinnable ground war that will seal its defeat. Why would the United States walk into such a well-laid trap? Professor Jiang attributes this monumental decision to a triad of miscalculation, three powerful motivating factors that have blinded American leadership to the immense risks. The first of these is hubris, or an extreme and dangerous overconfidence born from past successes. U.S. policymakers look at past regime change operations, such as the one in Libya in 2011, and draw the wrong lessons. They believe that a combination of air power and support for local opposition is a repeatable formula for success, underestimating the unique strategic depth and resilience of the Iranian state. This arrogance prevents them from seeing Iran not as another Libya or Iraq, but as a fundamentally different and more formidable challenge. The second factor is the powerful pull of domestic and international political calculations. For President Trump, a war with Iran offers several perceived benefits. It projects an image of strength and decisiveness to his political base. It serves the interests of key allies in the region, like Israel and Saudi Arabia, who may in turn provide financial and political support. Critically, a state of war could grant the president emergency powers, allowing him to take actions that would be impossible in peacetime. This confluence of political and personal interests can create a powerful incentive to choose a path of conflict, even when strategic analysis suggests it is fraught with peril. The third and perhaps most complex factor identified by Jiang is the influence of certain religious and ideological beliefs. He points to an eschatological or end-times worldview held by some influential groups within the American political landscape. In this belief system, a final, decisive confrontation with Iran is seen not just as a geopolitical necessity, but as a prophesied event, a necessary step in a divine plan. While this may not be the official policy of the U.S. government, the influence of such worldviews on key decision-makers and their supporters cannot be discounted. It adds a layer of zeal and conviction to the war effort that transcends rational strategic calculation. Together, these three factors, hubris, politics, and belief, create a potent cocktail that can lead a nation to make catastrophic decisions. They cloud judgment, marginalize dissenting voices, and create a narrative where war appears not only necessary, but also righteous and easily winnable. Professor Jiang argues that it is this internal triad of miscalculation, more than any external provocation from Iran, that has set the United States on its current disastrous course. The war was not just an outcome of escalating tensions, but a choice driven by a deeply flawed and dangerous mindset within the halls of power. In his concluding analysis, Professor Jiang paints a grim picture of the future should his prediction come to pass. A defeat in a war with Iran would not be a simple military loss, it would be a watershed moment signaling a fundamental shift in the global order. The consequences for the United States would be profound and far-reaching, impacting its economy, its international standing, and its own sense of national identity. It would mark the definitive end of the unipolar moment, the era of unchallenged American dominance that began with the collapse of the Soviet Union. The world we live in today, largely underwritten by American power, would be irrevocably changed. The most immediate consequence would be a catastrophic loss of American prestige and credibility. For decades, the United States has acted as the security guarantor for numerous allies around the world, from Europe to the Middle East to East Asia. A failure to defeat Iran, a regional power, would shatter the perception of American military invincibility. Allies would begin to question the value of American security guarantees and would be forced to seek their own accommodations with regional powers like Russia and China. The system of alliances that has been the bedrock of U.S. foreign policy for 75 years would begin to unravel, leading to a more chaotic and unstable multipolar world. Economically, the war would leave the United States deeply wounded. The immense financial cost of the conflict, combined with the global economic disruption caused by Iran's strategy, would likely trigger a severe and prolonged recession. The nation would be burdened with trillions in additional debt, while its economic rivals would be free to invest in their own growth. The US dollar's status as the world's primary reserve currency could be challenged as nations seek to diversify away from a system so vulnerable to American foreign policy decisions. This economic decline would further constrain America's ability to project power and influence on the world stage. Ultimately, Professor Jiang's prediction is a warning about the perils of overreach and the limits of military power in the 21st century. A loss to Iran would force a painful and difficult reckoning within the United States. It would compel the nation to confront the reality that its power is not infinite and that military force cannot solve all problems. While such a defeat would be a national trauma, Jiang suggests it could also be a necessary catalyst for change, forcing the U.S. to adopt a more realistic and sustainable role in the world. The path ahead, as foretold in 2024 and unfolding before our eyes in 2026, is one of immense peril, holding the potential for not just the defeat